Well, hello there, my fellow FileMaker friends, fans, and developers. This is Matt Petrowski creating FileMaker tutorials over at FileMakerMagazine.com. In this video, we're continuing with the FileMaker fundamentals, and what we're looking at today is learning the let function. Now, the let function is either highly useful to you as a developer or just completely elusive, and you don't understand when you might use it or how you might use it. Well, in this video, I'm hopefully going to give you a really good sense. Let's take a look. Before we get started, we need to cover a little bit of background, and basically that's what this database is about. What are you looking at on screen? Well, when I got married, I learned a little bit more about etiquette than I already knew, and that was basically how do you address a wedding invitation when it's either a female or a male and they have a guest, or the person has the same last name or a different last name. There's all kinds of different rules. And what I want you to note is that this database is in no way comprehensive. I simply chose this as an example. So as you can see, I have a very simple database with a first name and a last name, a gender of who that person is, and then a spouse's name. Now also I've got clearly Mickey Mouse here and Minnie as a spouse. Now Minnie does not have a last name specified, but as we move through the database and you look at this value right here of Mr. and Mrs. Mickey Mouse, that's what's actually being calculated. If I go to my next contact, Daisy Duck, she happens to be female. Now the order I learned was important. It needed to be the Mr. first and then the Mrs. So in this case, you can see that the name is not coming from the first name field, it's coming from the spouse's name. And again, the spouse's name is the same, or it doesn't have a last name. You can see right here I left a note, enter last name if different. And also take into account, this is making some drastic assumptions. There's no middle initials. It's specifically accounting for a two-part name if there's two parts in the spouse name. So here we have a fictitious marriage because we never knew if Goofy was actually married, but a Mr. Goofy Goof and Mrs. Clarabelle Cow. So now that you get the idea of what this is about and what we're trying to solve, we can take a look at how I initially solved it and wrote a calculation, how you might have written the calculation, and then how I used the let function. So let's take a look at that. The first thing that I'm going to do is dispense with the confusing parts and get you to where a working level really quickly. Now I'm in the data viewer in FileMaker Pro Advanced, and I'm going to create a new watch variable just for the purpose of being able to get to the let function. Now if you didn't already know, it's going to be under the logical functions, and you're going to scroll down and find let right there. Now if we take a look at this, what's really confusing to most users is the fact that FileMaker specifies everything in the front here as optional. The let must have a calculation or a result or a returned part, but understanding whether or not and how all of this works on first glance, it's just sort of confusing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to send this to a text editor. Now I use a text editor in order to edit a lot of my code because it allows me to easily indent. So let's get rid of that, and I'll simply type the shortcut of let. And what it's going to do is it's going to automatically, for me, create this extended version of the let. Now, quite simply, all you're going to do is you're going to declare a variable name. Now, a variable is simply just a slot. It's a slot to hold something, and that can be anything. So we're going to take a look at some examples that I'm going to bring up on screen. Alright, so what we're going to do to start off with is talk about what you can and can't do with the let function. And there are a lot of confusing aspects to the let function if you haven't used it a lot. And as I've stated before, I believe, this is about making your code clear and taking advantage of being able to make your code much more clear and easier to understand. That's what we're going to see when we see the example calculation, the one that actually combines the names. So here I have a defined local var. And just before I start, I want to mention that we're using the tilde here, or tilde, however you want to pronounce it. This is a standard that I've set up over at FileMakerStandards.org. Actually, not I, but I and the other people who are involved in FileMaker Standards. And basically what it does is it gives us the ability to identify throughout all of the FileMaker code, if we didn't have syntax highlighting, that the fact that this is a local variable. In other words, if I go right here and I put this to plain text and everything's white, even though I'm using an inverted editor, everything in the FileMaker calculation dialog, which we can see right here, is all monochromatic. It's black and white. So it becomes very difficult to see code within FileMaker's calculation editor without syntax highlighting, which would be very nice if FileMaker would add that. So that is the purpose of using the tilde, in order to know that something is a scoped variable within the context of a let. Now I mentioned the word scope, and what does that actually mean? Scope means that things can only reside or be set within the context of a let function. We're going to see where that applies. You can access things up in a higher scope, but things can't be set into the higher scope. So let's see what we've got here. A local variable is set to a literal string of expression. Now, one thing a lot of developers don't do or don't know that they can do is that they can reset the exact same variable and still reference any of the previous contents of that variable. So where local var was set to expression, the new setting of local var, or basically an override, is to take the value of local var, which is expression, and see that it will be expression can be set again to clarify code. So if you have a long string of code in one variable, you can break that up into multiple lines simply using the exact same variable. There's nothing wrong with doing that. Here we go with another let, and this variable is using a let in order to define that variable. Now we can see right here that we have a new var, and that new var, it can't be seen outside of this let. In other words, if I was to put in the value of new var right here, let's get that tilde up there, new var equal to, let's say for example, 200. What happens is FileMaker will first set new var to 200, then when it's going to set another var and it looks at this let, it will look at new var and it will completely override the fact that new var is currently 200. New var will become can't be seen outside this let. But yet you can see that the result can actually access, or anything within this let can access any variable that has been set outside of its scope. So local var being set to expression can be set again to clarify code will result, so we would get a result of but result can access expression can be set again to clarify code. That would be the result of another let. Now what you need to know is that if I was to change local var here within the scope of this particular let, what happens is even though local var has been set outside of the scope of this let, this local var would override by populating it with this. So we'll be able to see that when we actually do some testing. So we'll take that new var off right there. Now, one of the things that some developers don't know is that you can actually set script variables. And this can either be, as is mentioned right here, an override to a script variable that's set in a step outside of the current step containing this calculation code, or you can create the variable itself within this let function. Now again, using the tilde, what we've done is we're sort of trying to identify that even though this is a local variable, meaning it can be accessed by all other steps within the scope of the current script, what happens is if you didn't have or didn't use a convention like the tilde, then what happens is this could be a variable that is set in another step, and maybe you forget that it's actually something that's used within calculation code, and then you get an override. So that's where the tilde or the namespacing comes in handy. If we're outside of scope, what we're able to do with these script variables is we're able to set outside of scope. Where formerly, if we were to set a variable of new var, this value of new var cannot be accessed anywhere within this let. It can only be accessed within this let, even though this let can see things outside of itself. It can't set things outside of itself, but it can if it's a script variable. So you get to they're somewhat rare situations where you can use a let statement and script var can be set to change something. So what happens is where this variable was formerly set to override a variable or create within let, as soon as we go into this let, then this script var replaces it with change something. So if I was to return this outside of scope, what will happen is I will get can set a script variable outside to script. Whereas if I just return script var, we'll see that it would actually return just change something, because outside of scope happens after script var is set, and it replaces and overrides that variable outside. Global variables, pretty straightforward. We can set or initialize them, and of course you can do the same thing. Anything you do with a local variable, you can do with a global variable. Now hopefully you're starting to see this is pretty cool that we can do a lot of stuff within the let function that deals with other areas of FileMaker, including these local variables and global variables. Now the next thing I have to say is that you want to be as clear as possible with the names of your variables. This very clearly is a result, and it can be some resulting part of your script. And in fact, your calculated result, or the calculation which is the result of the let, doesn't have to be contained within the calculation portion. You can actually have a portion of one of your statements or one of your variables actually be a result, which is a result of any number of previously set variables, which include calculation code. Now this one was confusing when I first saw it right here. This is valid is equal to true is equal to true. Now this is a problem, or maybe not a problem, with FileMaker in that it doesn't differentiate between the assignment and the equality operator. So what FileMaker does is it looks at this assignment operator, then it looks at everything to the right and says, I need to evaluate this. So in other words, this says, is true equal to true? Well, yeah, that's true. So basically what it's saying is valid is true. So that's where you're able to use Booleans, and we're going to see an example of this in the code that we have that's actually executing our code, or our combination of names. Now once you really get into using the let function, then you're going to get into dynamic variables, where you are actually using a text string which will define a variable, but yet you're using some portion or some piece of FileMaker which is dynamic, such as using the getFieldName, which in this case I've got the technique name first, but it's basically a reference to the field which can contain the name that you want. In this case it's taking the name of the field and then also using the field value in order to dynamically create a variable. And that all happens by using an evaluate. And here I've got the create dynamic variable and some complex code down here which you can uncomment when you're taking a look at this. It says, if create dynamic variable, meaning you created the variable, then you can say a dynamic global variable was created, otherwise return false. And here you can see that commenting the result code to test portions is pretty much a common activity. You can create code within a variable and then just return the variable and comment it in order to see the results. So as I save this and move out, we can take a look at things by simply looking at the another let, or looking at the script var. So if I copy this and then paste here, I can look at any one of these variables. You can see that script var is being overridden by the outside of scope because it's setting script var. Whereas if I return local var, you can see right here we'll get local var, we'll copy that, and we'll put it as the result in order to see what we get there. And evaluate. You can see that it's taking the combination of the two, expression, and can be set again by building on itself. We can look at the another let, and pretty much you can go through all of these yourself and evaluate these and play with the results that you get. It's really pretty interesting to see what you can do and build within a let function. It really is super powerful in terms of organizing and keeping your code really clear. So I'll let you play with that because I want to get to the example of what is actually going to make this work. And we're going to get into what might be code that you may have or you might have used in a situation and how we cleaned it up and moved it into a let function. Let's take a look at that. All right, so here we go, the moment we've all been waiting for in this video, the actual example of a real world translation to the let function. Now, the code that I'm showing right now, and let me size this dialog box down so we can take a look at the code, is simply using a case statement looking at all of the different possibilities. And I'm going to give you a tip that you can use when you're going to break things down for using within the let function. You can see that what I have right here is a lot of repeated code, and this doesn't necessarily follow the dry principles covered in the previous video in this fundamental series. You can see that I have if gender equals male and is empty spouse, then it's going to be a Mr. If it's female and she does not have a spouse, it's going to be Ms. If it's gender male and there is more than one word within the spouse field, then we're going to assume that it has two different names, the first name and the last name. Now, word of forewarning, as I already mentioned, this does not account for all possibilities. But essentially, the case statement walks through all of the different potential situations. But you can see right here that I've got repeated code. Word count spouse is greater than or greater than 1. Word count spouse is greater than 1. I've got the combination of name first and name last, and I've got that here. I've got a combination of spouse and name last. So part of our goal with using the let is to make things clear as well as being able to take advantage of combining things and making the code dry. So let's comment this code out right here. And then we will take a look at the actual let function, which is the cleanup of all of that code. And hopefully what you're going to get is a sense of it becoming much more clear, easier to understand, easier to modify. So here's the tip right here, what I did. Gather all of the possible options before writing your calculation. And you're also going to think about all of the different conditions or attributes of the data before you start writing. Write these down on a notepad if you need to. It's a great way to start. I tend to just write mine right within the calculation. So I knew I was going to have salutations, and they were going to be based on different conditions of the data. The salutations I needed to know. I was going to have Mr. and Mrs., Mr., Mrs., or Miss. And here you go. If you need to double check on those salutations, I gave you the Wikipedia link that I used. So let's take a look at the code, and hopefully we can get this all on screen. There we go, all the way, and then scroll the let. So there we go. So as you read through this code on screen or within the technique file, hopefully you can see that it's pretty easy to understand, at least with regards to the names that I've chosen to use, because it's very clear in terms of what they say, because they say what they represent. Has spouse. And has spouse basically says if not is empty spouse, then that means they have a spouse. Now, one thing I'd like to point out is that it's certainly possible to do things in the inverse. In fact, there are times where you need to know that you can do things in the inverse. When I first started writing this calculation, I wrote the calculation with the word no spouse. Now, the difference between no spouse and has spouse is really just a matter of the logic that you use, because this would simply be is empty spouse. So within the context of your code, knowing when to use one over the other is simply a matter of your programming style, and sometimes it does come into play of which one you should use. So I chose to switch it from no spouse to has spouse, just because it tends to be the way that I programmed. It made a little more sense. And then I said, okay, well, there are different names. The different name situation, meaning different last names, is implied if the word count in the spouse is greater than 1. Now, this is an assumption that I made, and we'll talk about a little bit about the difference between spouse versus guest. And that's basically, in this situation, it is assumed, which you're going to see right here as a note, it's assumed that they are married with different last names by mere virtue of the fact that I chose to define the field as the word spouse. if it was guest, then I would simply have another field called guest. And this is where some developers get confused. How do I account for a guest within this calculation code? Well, you don't account for it necessarily within the calculation code. You need to actually add an extra field. And that's where a little bit of expertise and experience comes into play. So these first three items of has spouse, do they have different names, and is female are all definitions. Now, if you reflect on the code that we've already taken a look at, you can see that this is one of those Boolean switches or those Boolean logic. We can see right here, when you have an either-or situation, they're either female or they're male, I really only need to account for one. So if gender is equal to female, then is female is true. Otherwise, if not, then is female is false. It's the opposite. So it's a great way to very clearly identify something that within the rest of code, looking at this a lot of times, gender is female, gender equals male, gender does not equal female, doing all those different conditions is a lot more complex to read, at least, than just simply is female. And we can start to see that when we have some more complex code. If they have the same last name, that means that they have a spouse and they do not have different names. Well, quite clearly, that's the same last name. Finally, you can get to the actual salutation where we have this case which matches pretty much what we had up there, but it does it with singular pieces of data. Now, there is some code duplication. It's not purely dry. In fact, this code could be optimized even more, and that's ultimately the goal. But we have something that's really simple here. Case, same last name, then it's going to be Mr. and Mrs. with the Mr. always preceding. If it's a female and she does not have a spouse and we don't necessarily know, we're going to use the more correct Ms. If they're not female, then clearly that's got to be a Mr. And then otherwise we have a Mrs. Then finally we have the name. If they're female and they have the same last name, then we're going to use the spouse's name and their combined last, not combined, but their shared last name. That's what I mean to say. Otherwise, we're going to take their first name and their last name because it's either just a guy, just a girl, or they're using both of their names because they have, as we've already identified, different last names. So hopefully this becomes more clear. Or at least when somebody else comes into this, it's a little bit easier to read because the case or the result is very simple. If they have different names, then the man's name comes first. If it's female, then we're going to have Mr. and the spouse and the salutation and then the shared last name. Otherwise, we're going to have the salutation, which will result in Mr. and Mrs. And we're going to have the name and Mrs. Or excuse me, this is the case for when they're married with different last names, as is the comment right there. And this is very important. When you're creating super complex let functions, comment heavily. It makes it much easier to read. Finally, we have the default, which is salutation and name, which will get the Mr. and Mrs. if it's the shared last name. So I've covered the tip, and here is the code that we went through, or I walked through as an example at the very bottom that you can put into the data viewer and take a look at, parse if you want, take a look at each of the variables, play with them, and really understand how the let variable or the let function will allow you to clean up your code. Because as we walk through this now, we can see going all the way to the first record, Mickey Mouse, male, we get Mr. and Mrs. Mickey Mouse. Daisy Duck, female, Mr. and Mrs. Donald Duck, taking the spouse name. We get to one with the differing spouse name, Mr. Goofy Goof and Mrs. Clarabelle Cow. You can see right here that we've got Goofy Goof, and for those of you that don't know, which was the case with me, since I looked it up on the good old internet, Goofy's last name supposedly is Goof. I had no idea. Now there's one thing that I'm going to leave you with to clean up. Now in the previous case statement, it would say, please enter a value, please enter a name. Now, my implementation, if I was to implement this in real world, would not be a calculated value. And that's what a lot of developers do. In fact, unstored display calculations, summary fields, all of those things add to the weight and display of a database, causing FileMaker to do a lot of work. What's much easier is a stored value, which I would change this greeting to a text field with an auto enter calculation using this exact calculation. Because one of the things to note is that any field that is changed that is referenced within a let function acts as a trigger for the let function. So any field that is referenced in any of those variables, if it's changed, it would automatically be auto-entered into this value. So if they change the gender, if they change the name, if they change the spouse name, any of these fields automatically changed. But by being a text field and being auto-entered, I would be able to go in and manually make changes to this field by being able to take a look at the resulting text. So I'm automatically doing the work for the user based on the conditions that I know about, but giving them the opportunity to override by just making it a simple text field. And I'm also not incurring any of FileMaker's redraw calculation because it's not calculating on the fly. It was automatically stored. So hopefully I've done a good job of explaining the let function and, more importantly, why you would want to use it. Oh, but here's my little test for you. What you want to do is you want to, in the previous version, the case statement, which had multiple different results, it said, please enter name or whatever. That's when you want what you want to get into the let version. You want to take a look at that, walk through, and find out where you can actually get that in order to be the result if none of the conditions are met. In this case, basically, I'll give you a hint. All you're going to have to do is make sure all of the conditions are met, and here's your hint. Here's as far as I will go. Something very clear. All data present equals, and then I'll let you figure out the rest. So in other words, up at the top, you can have a case statement that says something like, if all data present, then return a result. Otherwise, return whatever your default is. So there's your little hint and your tip and what needs to be modified in this. I've always got to leave something for you to do. But as always, I'd like to wish you much luck with your own database. This is Matt Petrowski, and until next time, happy file making.